You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the political journalist Zoe Grunewald and the Daily Mail's Whitehall editor Claire Ellicott. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The continued advance by Ukrainian troops into Russia is lead in The Guardian. News of moves to end the long-running strikes by ASLEV train drivers with a new 15% pay offer is top story in the Daily Mail. On the day inflation rose, the Eye has mixed economic news, reporting an expected drop in interest rates, but also a forecast of lower mortgage rates. The Express chooses the day to launch a new campaign to restore the winter fuel allowance. The Times says business leaders have warned the government not to rush in new laws on workers' rights to avoid doing real damage to the economy. A Telegraph investigation claims that career criminals with more than 100 previous convictions are being spared jail, with more than 4,000 examples since 2007. The story of a Nottingham couple who was sent the wrong body after their son died from a heart attack in Cambodia is front-page lead in the Metro. The Financial Times reports that the sweet maker Mars is paying $36 billion to acquire the company that makes Pringles. And finally, the Star ridicules as deviants people who like to eat cold baked beans. The horror. A reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we're joined tonight by Zoe Grunewald and Claire Ellicott. Good to see you both. Let's start with The Guardian front page, and this being the story of the Ukrainian gains into Russia. This comes after the surprise incursion that nobody saw coming, at least of all Vladimir Putin. Zoe.
Yes, so Zelensky has said that Ukraine's troops had advanced several kilometres in the largest attack on Russia since the Second World War. This is very embarrassing, I think, for Putin. Previously, you know, he really felt like the balance of power was kind of in Russia's favour in this particular crisis, but actually increasingly we're seeing Ukraine push back with the support of the West. What we have now is Ukraine making this offensive, potentially to draw Russian forces away from the front lines of the conflict in Ukraine, but also maybe to seize some territory. So when it comes to striking peace deal talks, they will have some bargaining chips to play with. So, you know, it's really interesting to see Zelensky talking about this push into Russia and to be able to kind of shoot down the claim that Ukraine shot down a jet overnight where it also captured 100 Russian prisoners, and is also talking about claims of a drone strike. So it really feels like Ukraine is pushing forward in Russia and trying to redraw the balance of power there.
Yes, this incursion is entering its second week, Claire. One would imagine that there will be some retaliation from President Putin.
I think this is a great worry. So this has been an incredible strike by Zelensky and Ukraine, and fantastic for morale. The first time, you know, they've really had the upper hand in this conflict, which has been going on for so long. And you know, there's no denying that it's, you know, been successful so far. You've had lots of reports from Russia that they've stalled Ukrainian troops, but there's not a huge amount of evidence for that yet. And Ukraine are really going after some of the factories that are the places that are producing these glide bombs, which are having such a devastating effect in other bits of Ukraine where Russia is in Ukrainian territory. So it's a huge kind of boost for morale to have Ukraine actually move into Russia. But the deep worry is, where does this end? Because Russia is a nuclear power, and Putin has threatened this in the past. The last few years, he has said, you know, that any of his enemies will incur the ultimate kind of penalty. A clear hint that, you know, he would consider a nuclear strike. But there hasn't been that sort of inflammatory language from him since this happened. So the world can only hope that he doesn't respond in that way.
And so you were suggesting that it could be some sort of land grab to give them bargaining tools, with the article saying that Ukrainian officials are saying that Kyiv has no plans to occupy Russian territory, and the objective is to prevent Russian missile fire into Ukraine.
Yes, yeah. So the stated aim from Ukraine is to kind of redraw those Russian forces away from what's happening in Ukraine itself. But, you know, as Ukrainian forces move into Russia, And there's this, this image that went out on Ukraine state television last night of its troops pulling down a Russian flag from an official building in the Kursk region. You do get a sense that they are not only trying to embarrass Putin and trying to put pressure on the Russian forces, but also potentially do a bit of a land grab, and maybe that will give them some power when it comes to actually drawing up the new lines and dividing land and hopefully moving towards peace.
Let's move to the Mail, Claire. The headline there, Labour offers train drivers bumper pay deal to end strikes. This is after 2 years of disputes with the ASLEF rail union.
Yes, I think 18 strikes in 2 years by ASLEF, who represent, I think, 96% of train drivers. So this has been hugely crippling for the transport network and for anyone who travels on it. So it's been 2 years of pain, and there was some stat somewhere, I think 1 in 6 days have been lost to strikes since this began. Labour have taken power, and they have sided with the union. They've given them a below 15%, 14% pay rise, and I think it's over 3 years. But what they haven't done, crucially, is link any kind of sort of improvement in working. So I think under the Tories are offering about 8%, but they wanted there to be an increase in productivity for train drivers to work Sundays without it being overtime. And ASLEF has managed to rebuff this. Labour has agreed to this offer. So ASLEF has accepted it, so it looks like, I think I have to put it to members still, but it looks like, 2 years of train strikes are over, but at what cost? I think there's an estimate that it would cost about £100 million to increase the pay, and there's a real question over whether this will be paid for by rising ticket prices, which are already extraordinarily expensive, or whether the public, the taxpayer, will have to intervene.
And Zoe, members still do have to vote on this, but it does seem to be a breakthrough.
Yeah, I think ASLEF have really welcomed this particular deal. There seems to be lots of positive noises coming from the Transport Secretary, Lou Haig, and I think it is a really reasonable offer. I think what we've seen over the past couple of years with inflation outstripping wages, this standoff between the rail unions and the government, which has led, as Claire was pointing out, to so many millions in lost earnings, in lost days. And really, this just goes to show that if the government were up for negotiating with the unions and for giving people a pay rise in the face of inflation, then this could have been dealt with a lot sooner, and the economy wouldn't have suffered, and there wouldn't have been all this loss of productivity. One of the things Keir Starmer is really keen to do is to get this country, get the economy growing again. And the way to do that is to improve productivity. And one of the ways to do that is to ensure a better deal for workers. And I think this, and what we saw with the junior doctors the other week as well, shows that Labour is looking to empower workers as a means of getting the economy going again. And I think that's going to be very welcome.
Claire, the coverage in the Daily Telegraph is interesting. They're saying that Starmer caves to train drivers, suggesting a weakness almost.
Yes, that's the only way to describe it. I think Labour has obviously...
As a weakness?
No, well, how they're reporting.
Oh, right.
So I think the trouble is that, these strikes have been rumbling on for years, including with junior doctors and other public sector workers. I think there was always a feeling that, Labour were going to win the next election, and that the unions were well aware of that. And so no agreements were really made before that. Keir Starmer's now the Prime Minister, and, it's his first few weeks of power, and he's already made a deal with the junior doctors and with the train drivers. And these things it's welcome that the strikes surrendered, but the costs are high at the same time as Labour have taken away, the winter fuel payments from pensioners. It's quite clear whose side they're on. They are going to back, workers, as Zoe was saying, but these things all come with a huge price tag, and Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has warned that as a result of increasing the doctors' pay and public sector pay, that they're going to have to find £10 billion more, and that's all going to be paid for in the budget, and she'll have to make some tough decisions on tax when that comes.
So do you think this narrative of Keir Starmer of Labour being weak and caving into the unions and being, at the behest of the unions, do you think that's going to be pursued? That we'll see that in many headlines in the weeks and months to come?
Well, I think the right-leaning media have always portrayed this image of Labour, that they cave to their union paymasters. I mean, Labour is the party of workers. It has a good relationship with the unions, and it tries to advocate for workers. I think for too long in this country, the balance of power has been tipped in favour of business. And especially with the cost of living crisis and the economic hangover we saw from COVID and the war in Ukraine and energy prices, workers were really, really feeling the pinch. And there were lots of public sector workers who felt that the pay rise they had been offered, if any, simply wasn't fair for the amount of work they were expected to do. We know there's a crisis in the public sector in this country. One of the best ways to deal with that is to pay staff fairly and to invest in those services. And I think it's, you know, people, it was no surprise that the media have jumped on this and accused Starmer of caving, but I think it's the best way to get these services functioning properly and to get the economy moving.
Claire, meanwhile, we read in the Times that business leaders have warned the government that it risks doing real damage to the economy if it pushes ahead too quickly with the biggest overhaul of workers' rights for a generation.
Well, this is the counterpoint, that it is great to ensure that workers are paid well and to keep retention in business, keep people in these jobs, but they all come at a cost to the businesses that underpin the economy. And if you want to increase productivity, then you do have to work with businesses to ensure that they can hire more people and that the balance is fair, because otherwise they won't recruit people. And this story is about business leaders warning the government that if it pushes ahead with some of Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister's proposals for workers' reforms, there will, you know, some of the things she's suggesting are that workers would have rights from day one, they'd be able to claim maternity leave from day one, that they would have all sorts of rights to opt out of work when they're out of hours. Some of these, they sound really positive for workers, but businesses are not, you know, they're really going to affect their productivity, and they're warning about it, and they have been for some time. But we know now that the Employment Rights Bill, which will enshrine this all in law, will be tabled after Parliament returns on September the 2nd. So Labour are pressing ahead with it. Interestingly, during the election campaign, they sort of really rode back from it, and the Tories really accused them of these French-style union reforms to workers' rights. And there was quite a lot of reporting that they were going to abandon it, but it seems that Angela Rayner has come back and that, you know, they will be steaming ahead with it.
Zoe, is it a difficult balance for them between championing the rights of workers and paying attention to the interests of business?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, to govern, you have to understand that business has an influence in this country and you have to work with them. And I think, you know, it absolutely was the case that they seemed to row back a little bit over election time, which was obviously no surprise when they were trying to win the support of business. But I think, you know, it goes back to what I was saying about Labour really being the party of workers. That's its root. But also, when you're looking at the whole fabric and the whole picture of productivity in this country, it really does start with workers. And I think there are a lot of businesses, I mean, not all of them, but there are a few businesses in this country that have built business models that rely on having slightly exploitative terms for workers. And I think what's really important is if you want workers to be happy, more productive, more financially secure, spend more of their money without worrying about being made redundant or not having any rights, you have to strengthen their rights. And Labour have always said this is going to be done in consultation with business. They're going to make sure they do that. But equally, this is the sort of thing that can make a real difference to people's lives in this country very, very quickly.
OK, Zoe and Claire, thank you very much for the moment. Coming up, Liz Truss really doesn't like being compared to a head of lettuce. We'll discuss that next.
It's crisis on top of crisis and man-made crises. It's a man-made climate crisis. It's a man-made war. The Sudanese children are dealing with a man-made famine. But this latest report, which is the first of its kind, just looking at how temperatures have changed and seeing that in a large range of countries around the world, obviously some of them in Africa, children are enduring twice as many heat waves as their grandparents did 50, 60 years ago. So that means at the same time that they're spending more than half the year where it's above 35 degrees Celsius. I mean, I can tell you what that feels like. Here in Sudan, when I've been staying in Khartoum, the days are sweltering. You're in the 40s and there's very little places to hide. And when I mean hide, I mean from the heat, Leah, not so much from the live fire, which is everywhere. And then at night time, you know, you're in a room and there's no power, so there's no turning fan. So it just adds to that level of physical exhaustion that families are feeling. And that physical exhaustion has a real impact, of course, on pregnant women and on the youngest. Young children are not adults. Their bodies do not have the same kind of levels of resilience to this new level of heat. What they need, obviously, is a ceasefire. What they need is for organisations like UNICEF to be able to reach them everywhere. When I go into hospitals and I see the look of surgeons because they have our medicines, or I see mothers, as I did yesterday, getting vaccinations or getting that magical therapeutic pace for malnourished children, that's the game changer. But we need more funding to do that in those areas, and we need access across conflict lines. We need big business and governments to stop lying. There is a polluted heart to this climate crisis, and that's the fossil fuel industry. And as long as we allow emissions to keep ramping up, and they are, year in, year out, even though we have the knowledge, this is not a crisis of knowledge, it's a crisis of neglect. Even though we have that knowledge, that's what's happens. And other people in other countries, yes, we have some sort of a way of shouldering this kind of heat or cold. Although, of course, there's a cost of living crisis for people in the UK trying to endure those things. Other people don't have that safety net whatsoever. They simply have to absorb the heat at a time when water systems in a country like Sudan are being destroyed. So it's a mix of governments around the world focusing on children here with funding, the warring parties understanding what they are doing to children, and that those big businesses and fossil fuel industries have a responsibility outside their own industry, outside their own shareholders.
Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, Zoe Grunewald and Claire Ellicott. Let's take a look at the front page of The Times. And this story regarding the Met, Britain's biggest police force, is still failing to protect women and girls 2 years after being put into special measures. That's following the rape and murder of Sarah Everard. Zoe.
Yes, so an official inspection uncovered concerns about the Met Police, including evidence that victims were being put at risk by its failures to safely manage sex offenders and domestic abusers. It talks about there was an audit of sex offenders that revealed that high-risk registered sex offender, one of them hadn't been successfully visited since 2017. There were also examples cited of officers giving sex offenders notice of home visits, which allowed them to conceal equipment. And obviously, we know the Met was put in special measures by the policing watchdog in June 2022. And this was after, that report that revealed there was institutional misogyny and racism within the Met Police. I think there's a couple of things going on here. The Met Police has been under a lot of scrutiny over the past couple of years. One of the things is that the Met Police, like all police forces in the country, have dealt with a lack of resources and a lack of public funding. But the other is that there is this institutional culture within the Met Police that seems to affect how it deals with violent and sex crimes, particularly crimes that involve women and girls. And I think what we are seeing here is that clearly putting it into special measures hasn't made that difference. There is still issues with how they treat crimes to do with women and girls. And I think far more questions about whether the Met Police and the Met Commissioner are really getting on top of those issues that were identified, a couple of years ago now, ever since the murder of Sarah Everard.
Well, clearly they're not.
No. And there is actually a bit in this piece which suggests that they're actually performing worse than they did when the force was put in special measures 2 years ago. And we all remember the murder of Sarah Everard. She trusted a policeman, as we all are brought up to do, and the most vile thing happened to her. And after that, Mark Rowley came in and said, the Commissioner said that this wouldn't happen again, that he was going to reform the police and that hold it to higher standards. And this report suggests that that just hasn't happened. And I think there's lots of criticisms in this report of a failure to retain police officers, being lots of inexperienced staff, recruitment challenges. I mean, who would want to work for a police force that's had this terrible reputation for the last few years. And the fact that it's still not on top of any of this stuff, and we've seen reports yesterday about there being a massive increase in violence and sexual assaults on women and girls who are travelling on the transport network.
Yeah, 50% in the last 2 years.
And it just feels like, you know, we've had all the riots and we've had lots of things happening in London. It just feels like we need the Met to be a strong police force, and this report suggests otherwise.
And when we look at those attacks that we mentioned on the railways, that 50% increase, a lot of women feeling that they can't report these things to the police because that sense of trust is completely gone.
Yeah, when there was the report after the murder of Sarah Everard, the police commissioner said there's been a chilling effect on trust in the police. And we know that, you know, Keir Starmer has said on a number of occasions he wants to halve instances of violence against women and girls. He wants to bring in fast-track courts for people who have been accused of rape. He wants to get, you know, convictions up. He wants to bring back trust for women and girls in this country that they can report crimes and they'll be taken seriously. But when you read, you know, headline after headline like this, it really does feel like the police don't take this seriously. And actually, you know, Keir Starmer's spoken about root and branch reform of the Met Police. It just feels at this point like it's not fit for purpose. And there is something so rotten at the core as to how they deal with these kind of incidents that, you know, would reform be enough? Does more need to be done? If you really want to get a grip with the epidemic of violence against women and girls in this country, it really has to start with the police force.
Claire, just time to talk about a little maybe sense of humour failure by a certain Liz Truss. This is in the Metro.
Oh, Liz. So she was promoting her book, and I believe she was talking about Donald Trump and how she supported him when, led by Donkeys, a campaign group, lowered a banner saying, "I crashed the economy with the infamous lettuce," which the Daily Star famously compared her to. And had the public guessing on their live stream who would last longer, the lettuce or Liz. Unfortunately, the lettuce won, and Liz is here gathering her things and saying that wasn't funny. And she sent out a tweet today saying, "This isn't funny." She's not very happy.
Yeah. Zoe, I guess not helped by the fact that she was wearing green.
No, that was, maybe a poor choice of outfit, I'm afraid. It is so embarrassing, not just for her, but actually for the country, that we have a former Prime Minister who continuously seems to be publicly humiliated on the stage.
And Claire, thank you so much. See you at the top of the hour.